Okay, please let me know. I think it's setting it up. Okay, good. Now I can share my screen. Good. Okay, so let me just put this one here. Well, welcome everyone to today's seminar. My name is Adriana Maldonado Chaparro, and I will be your host today. Just a couple of things before we get started. First, I want to thank Eugenia Natoli for her awesome talk and discussion from last week on multiple paternity as a measure of ineffective male reproductive strategy, the case of free-ranging unknown urban domestic cats. We learned a lot about cats on this seminar, and it was pretty awesome. Second, our speaker for next week, Sylvia Kaiser. She will be talking about modulation of behavioral profiles by the social environment during sensitive phases of life. We look forward to her talk, and we invite you all to join next week. A couple things about the fine structure, just as a reminder, it's about 50 to an hour seminar, followed by a discussion that can last about 60 minutes. Please make sure to have your microphones mute, and by the end of Matthew's talk, you can type in your question mark. I will call your name. If you're on YouTube, make sure to type on your question mark as well. We make sure to relay your question to the moderator. And as always, we encourage the students to ask questions. So if you're a student next to the question mark, please type an X, and we'll make sure to call your name before anyone else. So with no further ado, I will like to introduce this week's speaker, Matthew Silk. Matt got his PhD at the University of Exeter in 2014, and he's currently a fellow of the Royal Society at University of Edinburgh. Previously, he was a Marie Curie Fellow at the CNRS in France. His research focuses on understanding the role of social behavior and demography on host population and host pathogen dynamics. And to tackle these kind of questions, he uses a lot of quantitative approaches to study social dynamics, population biology, and epidemiology, everything on wild populations. What is more cool is that he likes to look into the implications of these topics for infectious disease dynamics. Well, Matthew has a strong publication record as well with a very strong funding scheme. And he has contributed a lot to the advancement of social network science, especially with different methods and approaches to study networks. His seminar title is How Demography and Diseases Shape Animal Social Network Dynamics. So Matt, thank you for accepting our invitation, and the mic is all yours.
Amazing, thank you. Right, where? So this should be working now, I'm hoping.
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much, Adriana, for the really kind introduction. So really my hope for today is to talk a little bit about the role of demography and infectious disease actually in shaping animal social network dynamics and the emergent structure that results from these social dynamics of individual animals. And so this really lies at the core of my current research at the University of Edinburgh, which is thinking about the role of animal social systems in long-term patterns of disease in animal populations. But it's going to feature kind of things that I've studied and worked on all through my career so far, so starting right from my PhD research. And really the starting point for this, I think, for a behavioral audience at least, is to point out that animal social systems vary hugely, both in their social network structure and social network dynamics. So I'm aware that not everyone here we'll be working actively on social networks, and social networks are going to feature very prominently all the way through this talk. And so when I'm talking about a social network, I'm talking about the graphs you can see on this slide, where the points or the nodes represent individual animals, and the lines or the edges connecting them represent individuals that have interacted or associated with each other. And we can weight these edges according to the strength of these relationships or associations between individuals. And what we can see is that we can use social networks to quantify variation in the structure of animal social systems, right from species that we might think of as living in relatively stable social groups, through to situations where individuals mix much more freely in fish and fusion populations, for example, in ungulates or geese in the bottom left, but still might maintain preferred social relationships with each other, right through to systems where individuals, at least when controlling for confounding effects of space, might interact almost at random. But it's not just the structure of animal social systems that varies, but it's also the dynamics of these systems and the temporal scales at which these dynamics vary. And so just thinking back to the study species that I worked on for my PhD, so these are light-bellied brent geese, and they're migratory birds that spend the winter around the coasts of Western Europe, but spend spring in Iceland on their migration and breed right up in the Canadian Arctic. And so the social network structure of brent geese varies considerably across a range of temporal cycles. So you could think when they're feeding in large foraging flocks during the winter period, that their social networks change dynamically with tidal cycles as they move from feeding on intertidal areas through to feeding on terrestrial grasslands and farmland. They also vary in their social dynamics across daily cycles as they move from these foraging flocks to larger roosting flocks in particular locations. But it's not just over these short timescales that these social networks are changing. They're also going to change across seasonal timescales as the brent geese move from one staging area to another, and as their social system changes completely during their reproductive period. And so hopefully this demonstrates how a huge number of different factors can contribute to both the dynamics as well as the structure of animal social systems. And I think this is really important to think about because this variation in both social network structure and social network dynamics is hugely important in explaining ecological and evolutionary outcomes. And so I'm going to talk a little bit on this slide about infectious disease because that's something that I'm very familiar with and know very well. And it's been increasingly well studied, both theoretically and now empirically, that the structure of social networks is really fundamentally important for the epidemiology of infectious diseases that spread across these networks. So whether this be super spreader dynamics, so the idea that there being particular well-connected individuals in a population completely changes the expected outbreak dynamics, or things like the presence of subgroups, or what we would call in social network research, social communities, that can slow down the spread of infectious diseases and potentially completely change the way we might manage these diseases and who we might target for vaccination, for example. But it's not just the network structure that's really important, but theoretical models have long since established that the network dynamics also play a fundamental role in the epidemiology of infectious disease. And this is so much so that actually in certain situations, social mixing completely and can fundamentally change this epidemiological landscape, and mean that thinking about social networks purely as static entities can be completely inadequate in describing or capturing the types of process that we're interested in. And this will obviously depend a little bit on the types of social dynamics that we're thinking about and the timescales of which we're studying things over. And so hopefully this explains how thinking about both network dynamics and network structure is really important in understanding some of the ecological and evolutionary consequences of animal social networks. But I think what's particularly challenging here is despite social networks being increasingly well studied in wild populations, we still understand relatively little about the evolutionary ecology of these social networks. And in particular, I think something that's missing is that we're really lacking theory on what we would expect the eco-evolutionary dynamics of animal social structure to be. And I think it's only by better developing this theory related to social network eco-evolutionary dynamics that it can help us quantify some of the general patterns that we might be interested in when trying to explain this huge diversity we see in animal social structures in nature. And so today I'm really going to focus on two particular aspects that I think play a really important role in shaping how animals interact with each other. And these are demography and population dynamics and infectious disease. And so rather than talking about concepts here, I just wanted to show some examples of some recent papers that have really looked at the role that these processes play in shaping how animals interact and associate. And it's been something that's been a real focus of research in recent years, and especially in relation to the COVID pandemic, the role of infectious disease in shaping social dynamics and social responses has received particular attention. And so really my aim for today is to provide a series of kind of case studies or examples that combines theoretical modeling based on real-world animal social data and some empirical data analyses that look at the role of demography and infectious disease in shaping animal social networks. And initially, for most of the talk, I'm going to think about this at an ecological timescale, so thinking about behavioral plasticity and how things are related to just changes in population ecology, for example. But towards the end of the talk, I'm going to touch on the evolutionary dynamics that I think are in part what make this such a fascinating challenge and area of research. And so in this first part of the talk, we're really going to start by thinking about demography as a constraint on social network formation in animal groups. We're going to then think a little bit about turnover of individuals in groups and populations and what it means for individual social behavior. And then finally going to think a little bit about the role of infectious disease and how infectious disease might actually shape who individuals interact with in their groups. And so in this first part of the talk, I'm really thinking a lot about life history variation in animals. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on the fast-slow axis of life history variation, or the pace of life history, which, while it doesn't explain all of life history variation within animal populations, is a key axis of life history variation that can explain around 2/3 of the variation among species in life history traits. And so when we think about the fast-slow continuum, we're moving from a situation where we might have particular fast species, and these are species characterized by high mortality rates, so they live for a relatively short amount of time, but they will also have high rates of recruitment into the adult population. At the opposite end of this spectrum, we have slower species that have much lower mortality rates. They survive for much longer, but they also have much lower rates of recruitment. And so this often is quite strongly related to body mass. So we might have large and slow species and small and fast species, but it can also vary independent of body mass. So you could think, for example, of many mice species might represent faster life histories, whilst bats, which are a similar size, might represent examples of animals with slower life histories. And together with Dave Hodgson a few years ago now, we speculated that slow life histories might at times favor more differentiated social relationships between individuals. And what I mean when I'm talking about differentiated social relationships is the idea that you might target your social energy, so your interactions and associations, at particular other individuals in the population at the expense of others. So when we think about an undifferentiated social network, you're interacting fairly evenly with all of your neighbors. Whilst with a highly differentiated social network, you're investing a lot in forming strong social relationships with particular other individuals. And the reasons that we suggested this might be the case rest on several related arguments. And the first of these is that social bonds and strong social relationships might be associated with delayed benefit. So it might be something that initially is a behavior that you invest heavily in and carries a net cost, but over time, these social bonds and social relationships become more and more beneficial, and so the net benefit only occurs after a certain period of time. Obviously, if we then assume that fast and slow species have opportunities to interact or associate at similar rates, then longer-lived slow species have more opportunity to benefit from these delayed benefits of social relationships. Another factor that's related to the longevity of species is the level of demographic turnover in populations. And so it might be that the relative differences in mortality rate affect the stability of the social environment of particular species. And then finally, we can also think about the other side of forming strong social relationships, and that is that by targeting social interactions or social relationships at particular other individuals, you have to avoid or neglect others. And this comes with opportunity costs, and it may be, depending on what is selected more strongly, survival or reproduction, that there's variation in these opportunity costs across this fast-slow continuum. So all of these things acting together could potentially, at least we think, contribute to differences in social network structure according to demography. Today, what I'm going to focus on briefly with a theoretical example is this idea of demographic turnover and the role of demographic constraints in shaping emergent social network outcomes. And so this is very new work, so I'm particularly excited to hear what people think about it. But it builds on a baseline model, and this is a baseline model that was developed by the lab of Nina Pfefferman. So Nina was one of my former postdoc advisors. And in this model that Nina's lab developed, every individual in the population has 5 social connections or social preferences that they can choose to direct at any other individual in the population. At every time point in this model, these individuals are then going to drop their 2 least popular social connections, so their social connections with other individuals that have the lowest in degree or fewest other individuals connecting to them, and they're going to replace these 2 connections with 2 random connections from the population. So this model is making the assumption that everyone has a fairly fixed amount of social energy or fixed number of social interactions, and also that they know the social network position of those that they are interacting with or have shared social relationships with, but they don't know the social network position of others, which I think is a pretty reasonable starting point for a simple model of an animal group. What we can then do is monitor how this social network changes over time. And what we see when we allow this social network to change over time is gradually the network of our group becomes more and more centralized. Everyone eventually is deciding who are the most popular individuals in the group and targeting their connections at them. So if you look at the network in the top right of the slide here, you can see that we have 3 individuals. The fact that it's 3 is a little bit obscured, that have a very high in degree, and most of the other individuals have a very low in degree. And the reason that this is 3 individuals and not 5 is that at every time step, every individual has to drop 2 connections. So it's only 3 from their initial 5 that are going to be to the most popular individuals. And so hopefully that this demonstrates that through these very simple rules of social dynamics, we can end up with a highly organized social network with a very centralized structure. What we're now in the process of doing is updating this model to include demographic processes, and this is work that's led by a new PhD student, Ross Walker, that I'm helping to co-supervise. And so we're going to use the exact same model for social updating and for the social connections that individuals have, but what we're now going to do is introduce a basic density-dependent model for population dynamics. And this is going to be implemented through a Gillespie algorithm, so these demographic updates are happening continuously. We're also going to include, and this is unfortunately something that I'm not going to have time to talk about during the presentation, but I'm happy to discuss afterwards, different types of social inheritance in this model. And with this demographic constraint, we're now going to monitor once again how our social network changes over time. The key thing about our new model is that while we have the same rate of social updating, we allow this rate of social updating to occur at different speeds relative to our demographic model. And this is all going to be controlled by a parameter that we're going to call sigma. And the important thing that you need to know about sigma is that when sigma is very low, It allows there to be many social updates per average lifetime of an individual. And if sigma is higher, so closer to our maximum at 0.5, it allows relatively few social updates per average lifetime. So if we make an assumption that independent of life history, individuals are making social updates to their social relationships at a similar rate, then we can assume that low values of sigma represent slow species, and higher values of sigma represent fast species. And an important point about sigma as well that I'd like to make before showing the results is that a sigma value of 0 indicates no demographic turnover at all. So that will take us back to our baseline model situation. We can then use our model to ask a question about this relative rate of social and demographic dynamics. And so we can ask how the relative rate of social updating relative to population dynamics affects the final social network structure that we see. And so I'm going to show these results in two slightly different ways. I'm first going to show the social networks, and then after that I'm going to show a plot of sigma against a measure of our social network organization. And so with this initial plot with our social networks, the key point that I want you to take away is that we have networks with higher values of sigma, so that's more representative of fast species at the top, and networks with lower values of sigma at the bottom. And you can see the original baseline model is in the bottom right, where sigma equals 0. And hopefully what you can see here is that as sigma declines, the level of organization in our network, so how central our most central individuals are, increases. And so this suggests that demography is placing really important constraints on social organization in our model, and that the strongest social organizations are only really possible when sigma is low. And so this model is suggesting, at least theoretically with the set of assumptions that we've made, that demography is placing less constraints on the social organization of slow species that are longer lived than it would be on the social organization of faster species, as long as we assume that they're updating their social relationships over at similar rates. What we can see is that this level of social organization declines exponentially as a function of the relative rate of social updates. So a lot of this decline happens immediately before leveling off. And what I'm going to touch on, but I can't explain fully right now, is that this rate of decline is also partially dependent on the mechanism of social inheritance. And so how quickly the organization of the network, so the popularity score, changes with values of sigma depends on whether individuals inherit no social connections or whether they inherit the social connections of their parents. And hopefully this example demonstrates really nicely how we can use relatively simple theory to look at some of the important factors that might shape the development of emergent social networks in animal groups and populations. However, I think demography isn't just a constraint when it comes to social networks. There's really important feedbacks that occur between population level processes and individual social behavior. And social networks and social structure are a really important mediator of this. So not only do population dynamics and population size, for example, shape patterns of shape social network structure, for example, by influencing the density of individuals in the population. But we now know, and it's well documented in behavioral ecology, that individual social network position and the social relationships of individuals will influence demographic traits like survival that will then feed back into key aspects of population dynamics and demographic structure. And what this does is create a really important feedback loop between demography and social behavior, which makes it very important to think about the role of networks and social structure in potentially explaining the response of social species to population change or environmental change, for example. And this feedback loop makes these predictions quite challenging, and I think is a really interesting area of research. And so in this next part of the talk, I really wanted to focus on how individuals might adjust their social networks and how population social structure might change in response to these demographic processes. And so in the first of these examples, I want to focus at an individual level and think about individual level social networks and how individuals might adjust their individual social networks to the loss of social associations. This is all well and good, but it doesn't really move us up to the population level. So in the second part, I'm going to use a second example to think about how social structure might be shaped by population dynamics overall. And so the first of these examples is research conducted by a colleague of mine during my PhD, B. Downing, on Canada geese at the Cotswold Water Park in the UK. So this is a large area of gravel pits, so artificial lakes in the southwest of England. And this area hosts a large resident population of non-native Canada geese. So this population can potentially cause problems with human-wildlife conflict and is therefore subject to occasional management interventions. And what we did during this study was measure the social association network of this population before and after the planned removal of individuals. And so hopefully you can see in the social network on the right, and this is a social network showing only the stronger social relationships. We have a pretty typical fission-fusion social system in which individuals form clusters with others that they interact with or associate with more frequently, but mix fairly easily across our population. The individuals that were removed from the network during a planned cull are highlighted in blue, and hopefully you can see that these individuals aren't distributed evenly across the whole population. And so the question becomes, how do individuals respond to the loss of their flock mates? And so this graph that I'm going to show now is a little bit complicated perhaps, but I'm going to talk you through it step by step. And the broad result that I want you to take away from it is that birds that were molted either near to geographically cull sites or were strongly connected within their social network, birds that were removed during the cull tended to change their behavior, but they did so in a way that compensated for their lost social associates. And so if we look at individual social network metrics, so we're looking at strength here, so weighted degree, or the total sum of an individual's social associations, and then also its mean strength of connection to other individuals, we can see that the strength increases from before to after the cull in birds that were present at cull locations, becoming more similar to birds that were present elsewhere after the cull. And we can see that they achieve this by not increasing the number of birds they're connected to, but instead by increasing the mean strength of their connections to birds that they're already connected with. What we can then do is break this down to look at this at a dyadic level. So now we're looking or modeling the presence or absence or strength of the connections between particular individuals. And we're going to do this for 3 different types of connections. We're going to do it for retained associates, so this is individuals that other individuals that an individual was connected to both before and after a cull. We're going to do it for associate, the probability that they lose an associate, and then on the bottom right, the probability that they gain an associate. Once again, the color red is the important color here, and the color red represents dyads for which both individuals molted at a cull site, so those that we would expect to be most impacted by the cull. And then our x-axis shows their aggregate strength to the removed individuals, so the strength of their social connections to the individuals that were removed. And what I want you to see here is that as we increase the social and spatial proximity to a cull, we tend to see that they're more likely to increase the strength of their associations if they retain their associates. They'll also become less likely to lose an association, and at least when the aggregate strength is relatively low, they're also more likely to gain associations, as long as both of those individuals molted at a cull site. What we can actually see by looking at the blue line so those that are present elsewhere, is we see that the probability of losing associates actually increases, especially when they're more strongly connected to individuals that were removed. So all of these results are actually painting a very similar picture, and that is that birds are adjusting their social networks, not by ranging more widely and forming more social connections, as many predictions of social perturbation might be, but instead that they're strengthening their existing connections and those with their neighbouring individuals. And this suggests it's very much a compensatory mechanism. So this could potentially have important ecological or evolutionary consequences. And while it may have an impact, for example, on the spread of infectious diseases by causing short-term patterns of rewiring connections, what it doesn't do is have far-reaching implications across the population as a whole. But really, this example is just focused at an individual level, and I'm making kind of assumptions when scaling these results up to a population level outcome. And so to think more about population level ecology and linking it to patterns in social structure, I want to move on to thinking about a second empirical case study. And this empirical case study is going to involve European badgers at Woodchester Park in the UK. So Woodchester Park is coincidentally actually quite near to the Cotswold Water Park. It's an area in the Cotswold Hills in southwest England, which has been this location of a long-term study of badgers and bovine tuberculosis. And Woodchester Park is perfect badger habitat. It's a steep-sided wooded valley, and badgers develop their set locations or the communal burrow systems that they use as refuges in these wooded banks of the valley and feed on the agricultural land that's nearby. Badgers in high-density populations like this form territorial social groups with these territories of these social groups associated with these set locations. And what I'm going to talk about during this example is a movement network based on movement of individual badgers between different groups that's based on this 40-year capture-recapture study. And so this is the one part of my talk where I'm going to talk about a network that's not really a social network. So now we're thinking about a network where the nodes represent locations or represent social groups, and the edges represent the movement of individual badgers between these groups. And hopefully you can see just by looking at this network, there's already some potentially interesting patterns. I always find it particularly interesting to look at the fact that badgers really don't like crossing lakes or crossing the valley floor. But we used network models to try and examine the structure of this movement network and how it changes over time. And so the first thing I really want to draw your attention to is if we look at this movement network through different temporal snapshots, what we see is that the structure is actually remarkably consistent. However, while it tends to be similar pairs of groups that are connected to each other, what we tend to see is that the density of the movement network, so the number of movements occurring between groups, is occurring at different frequencies between different time periods. So the network, for example, is much more connected between 1988 and 1990 than it is between 1992 and 1994. As I said, we can look at what explains these patterns with network models, and we can show a number of consistent patterns. And so the first thing to draw your attention to is that the distance between groups is really important. So as two badger groups get further apart in space, they're less likely to be connected, or there's weaker connections between them in the movement network. What we can also see is even while controlling for the distance between groups, the previous time period is important. So this suggests that the badger movement network structure is very consistent and stable over time. We looked as well at the role of group size or differences in group size, and we found that this didn't have a consistent effect throughout the entire study period. But perhaps interestingly, we did see an effect of reciprocity. So this is the idea that if badgers are more likely to move from Group A to Group B, they're also more likely to move from Group B back to Group A. And so this actually points against there being some element of source-sink dynamics, for example, in the badger movement networks, and instead points to the idea that maybe there's habitat barriers or potentially social barriers to movements between these groups. So this might be areas of unsuitable habitat that makes it hard to move between two groups even if they're close together, or it might be that there's some aspects, for example, of genetic relatedness between groups that makes exchange of individuals between these groups more likely. But for now, I'm going to focus mainly on this distance effect and the idea that the distance between two groups is important in explaining the movement of badgers between them. And in particular, we're going to think about the strength of this distance effect and how it depends on population dynamics. And whilst there's no effect of the population size in its own right on this distance effect, what we can see is that the population dynamics, so the change in population size, is really important in shaping the importance of the distance between two groups in explaining badger movements. And what we see is that when the population is increasing, so towards the right-hand side of this graph, we see a much weaker distance effect. So movements are much more likely across wider gaps and over wider areas, whilst when the population is declining, we see a much stronger distance effect, implying that when the population is decreasing in size, we only see movements between neighbouring groups. And this suggests that this social structure of the population as a whole is changing considerably depending on whether the population is going up or the population is going down. And the population is becoming much more socially structured when it's declining. This is something that's potentially really interesting to learn from the context of thinking about infectious disease epidemiology and how it shapes feedbacks between population dynamics and infectious disease spread. And that's something that I'd also be happy to discuss later if people are interested. But I think that's probably enough about demography for just now. And instead I want to talk about some theoretical work thinking about the role of infectious disease in animal social dynamics and social structure. And so the starting point for this work is really that infectious disease risk for individuals is likely to increase as they engage in more social interactions with other individuals. So the higher your degree or the higher number of individuals you're connected to, the more you put yourself at risk of acquiring an infection. But we also know from really extensive research in behavioral ecology that avoiding social interactions can be costly for a whole host of other reasons. So this could be, for example, for avoiding predators, or it could be for gaining information about where to feed, for example. And this might lead us to make a couple of predictions relating to these to behaviors where individuals might try and avoid infectious disease. And the first of these is that individuals might only adjust their behavior when disease risk is very high. And the second is that if individuals do vary in the benefits they gain from interacting with others, but potentially also they might vary in the costs of being infected by disease, then they might respond to infectious disease in different ways. And this is something that we might expect to be true. For example, we know even in human populations that individuals vary considerably in the severity of an infection once they get ill. And so for this part of the talk, I'm really using game theoretic models of individual behavior and doing this in the context of an endemic disease. So we're going to use a very simple disease model that I hope is quite straightforward to follow. And this is a model where individuals can only either be susceptible or they can be infected. And they move between these two classes depending on their interactions with infected individuals, or depending for susceptible individuals on their interactions with infected individuals, and for infected individuals based on a time frame over which they're infected. As soon as an individual recovers from infection, it can be reinfected according to this model. This is perhaps an oversimplistic model of disease spread. It makes it mathematically very convenient to simulate situations where the disease persists in a population or group over time. What we can show when we run our models of individual behavior with this disease model is that without any individual variation, we see that the stable infection rate, so the prevalence of our disease, depends very strongly on the ratio of social benefits to disease costs. And hopefully this result is nice and intuitive. If you gain a huge amount from interacting with other individuals, or if the disease is really costly once you're infected, then the stable level of socialization, and so the stable prevalence, is going to be very low. If instead the disease is not very costly at all, or you don't, if the disease is not very costly at all, or you gain a lot from interacting with others, then you're going to have a very high stable prevalence of disease. And if the disease is very costly, or you don't have much to gain from interacting with others, then you're going to have a very low prevalence of disease. I'm sorry for messing that one up. So hopefully that demonstrates nicely that the model is working fairly effectively. It's producing results that we would expect without this individual variation. But what we're going to do now with the model is introduce a situation where we now give individuals one of 4 different phenotypes. And these four phenotypes are going to be the outcome of variation across 2 different axes. So we're going to vary individuals in their sociality from being asocial, so these are the individuals that don't gain very much from interacting with others, through to being social, which are the individuals that gain a lot from interacting with other individuals. And we're also going to vary individuals in their risk aversion. So we're going to have risk-averse individuals, so these are the individuals for which disease might be very costly, and we're going to have risk-tolerant individuals. So these are individuals for which the costs of disease are much lower, so they're not so worried about being infected. And so this is work that was led by a mathematical modelling postdoc in Nina Pfeffman's lab, Matthew Young. When we let these models play out over time and allow individuals to adjust their rates of behaviour, we once again see that our level of socialization and our infection rate eventually becomes stable. But what we now see is that our stable infection rates and our stable levels of socialization are different from our different phenotypes. And hopefully, exactly as you expected, what we see is that the level of infection is highest for our highly social and risk-tolerant individuals, and our level of infection is lowest for the asocial and the risk-averse individuals. And for socialization, these patterns are exactly opposite. So you're paying for high rates of you're paying for high rates of socialization with high rates of infection. And so hopefully, again, so far so intuitive. If you want to be social, you pay the costs of being infected. But what we can do with these results is look at not only how much individuals are socializing, but also who they're socializing with. And this is, for me, where these results get really interesting and quite exciting. And what I want to draw your attention to in this plot on the right here is comparing the diagonal of this matrix of plots to the off-diagonal. And so what the diagonal is showing is the tendency of individuals to socialize with others of the same phenotype as themselves, whilst the off-diagonal is showing the tendency for individuals to socialize with other different phenotypes. And hopefully what you can see is that once the simulation is stabilized, we see a situation where individuals are only socializing with those of the exact same phenotype as themselves. And this shows that as soon as we have this individual variation, then infectious disease becomes a really important factor in leading to homophily or social assortment according to the phenotypes of individuals in these groups. And I think this is a really fascinating result to think about in the context of animal social evolution and ecology. I've made some quite strong assumptions when talking about these results, and I wanted to place a little bit of a caveat on these results and provide a little bit of extra context. And that is that how strong this assortment is can vary when you relax some of the assumptions that we've made. So if you make it so that the individual variation in sociability and our risk aversion, so our differences between our phenotypes, is less clear, then you tend to get less social assortment, so less homophily in this graph here. And the other thing that we can test with this model is we can actually input existing social relationships that might be important to an individual. So this might be individuals that you share social bonds with. It might, for example, also be kin that you might want to continue interacting with. And if we introduce these important existing social relationships, then we can also see a reduction in the amount of homophily. And so I think with even just these simple axes of variation, we might be able to make a prediction for the sort of social dynamics we might expect from different animal groups, depending on the extent to which they meet the different assumptions included in this model. And so I'm really hoping that with this first part of the talk, I've demonstrated how demography and infectious disease at this ecological timescale, so not thinking about evolutionary change at all, can be two really key processes in shaping how animal social networks change over time and the emergent outcomes that result. My aim with the second part of the talk is to think a little bit more about evolutionary change. And I'm going to do this by first talking about an empirically based example relating infectious disease and social aging. And then I'm going to go on a little bit to talk about some very new work, thinking about the evolutionary demography of social networks themselves. And so I wanted to start with social aging, as I think this is now an increasingly well-studied example of network dynamics at an individual level that's been documented in an increasing range of species. So especially in primates, but increasingly outside primates now, for example, in ungulates and vultures. And social aging tends to capture the idea that individuals become less central in their social networks over time. So they're becoming less socially connected as they get older. One study that particularly captured my attention in this regard was work conducted by Erin Siracusa in Lauren Brent's lab in Exeter, looking at the fact that old rhesus macaques are not only becoming less socially central as they get older, but they're doing so by becoming more choosy with their social partners. So they're maintaining the overall strength of their social connections, but they're doing this by targeting their interactions at particular social partners that they know well and avoiding other individuals. This is really interesting from the idea of trying to understand why it's happening, and as someone who studies infectious disease spread, as one of the potential hypotheses explaining this is that this might be a protective behavior against the greater risks of infection when you're old. And so actually this study provides a really nice natural experiment to look at the potential value of these social aging to providing protection from infectious disease costs when you're interacting in an animal group. Are these reductions in social network centrality are actually enough to provide you a benefit? And might it be that older individuals do benefit more from any reductions in their social network centrality? So I'm going to talk about a little study that we did using simulation models to test this idea that was led by Erin and by Melissa Pavez-Fox, who both have worked extensively on the Cayo Santiago rhesus macaques. And for this study, what we did was we took 23 group years of rhesus macaque social network data from Cayo Santiago, and we combined this with another network epidemiological model for an endemic pathogen. Hopefully you can see a bit of a theme here. Once again, this model was a very simple epidemiological model. It was a susceptible infected model. So the same model that I talked about earlier, individuals can either be susceptible, so infection-free, or they can be infected. But what we did in this version of the model is that we assumed that for every time step an individual was infected, it paid a cost for being infected. What we could then do is ask whether old individuals being choosy with their social partners is enough to protect them from these arbitrary costs of infectious disease that we introduced into our model. I'm going to first focus on the broad patterns that we saw and then dive into particular details of the results bit by bit. And to demonstrate the role of social network, or the interacting roles of social network centrality and age in explaining the patterns of disease costs that we saw, we fitted different combinations of models. So first we modeled these two things independently. So we tested whether there was a relationship between social network centrality and disease costs, and there was a strong positive effect. So that individuals that are more central in their social networks pay higher costs of disease at the end of the simulation. We could also, when they were modeled independently, show an equivalent negative effect of age. So older individuals tended to have lower disease costs at the end of the simulation. However, when we modeled these two things together, what we see is that while we maintain a strong effect of social network centrality on disease costs, we lose any clear effect on age. And what this shows really nicely is that older individuals are paying lower disease costs, and this is almost entirely explained by them being less central in the social network. What we can do is then look at how this protective effect changes across different parameter values in our model. So for example, we can look at the transmissibility of the pathogen we're interested in, and we can show that this social aging effect is more protective for pathogens that spread more easily, so with intermediate or higher transmissibility, rather than for pathogens that are only spreading very slowly through the group. We can also potentially assume that old individuals might suffer more from disease. So it might be that old individuals are more susceptible to disease, so they're more likely to get infected in the first place. It might be that for every time step that they are infected with disease, they pay a higher disease cost. So when they're infected, their illness is more severe than it would be for a younger individual. And then finally, it might also be that they are infected for a longer duration than younger individuals. So immunosenescent older individuals are less able to fight an infection and so stay ill for longer. We have evidence to suggest that this is true. These potential explanations are true in a range of different species. And what we do when we look at this is that we see that infection severity is by far the most important factor in explaining the protective effect of older individuals reducing their social network centrality. So it seems that when immunosenescence leads to increasing severity of disease in older individuals, we might expect this to have the potentially strongest influence on any evolutionary changes in social behaviour. We can also use our results to look at how changing your social network centrality in our different age categories could reduce your costs of infection. And so in this graph, I want you to compare the pink rectangle on the right-hand side to the darker pink rectangle on the left-hand side, and see that when you're an older individual, reducing your social network centrality, so here we have closeness centrality as an example, from being high to average or below average, reduces your infection costs a lot more than making the same change when you're younger. And these effects are especially strong, once again, when we're including immunosenescence in our model. And then finally, we also explored this for a range of different social network measures. So we looked at degree, we looked at strength, so that's the weighted degree or the combined weight of connections, and also a measure closeness centrality that looks at the importance of indirect connections as well. And what we could show is that being able to reduce some aspects of your social network centrality is much more important to reducing your infectious disease costs than others. And so in particular, we showed that reducing closeness centrality and reducing strength was the most impactful for reducing your infectious disease cost. And what was particularly interesting about this result was the fact that in reality, what the Kaio macaques seem to be doing is reducing their closeness centrality and their degree. And I think this is potentially particularly interesting and worthy of additional work, because what I suspect is happening is strength is the best proxy for many of the other benefits that individuals gain by interacting with others, and so they're constrained and unable to reduce the weight of their connections, and so instead they do the best job that they can in reducing their number of connections and their indirect connectivity instead. So I think this work has some really nice, interesting implications for thinking about the role of infectious disease in social aging, but thinking about or implying evolutionary change is really challenging in this situation, partly because we're working with old individuals for which the strength of selection is not entirely clear, but also thinking about evolution in a social network context can be incredibly challenging. And that's something that I wanted to explore a little bit in the final part of this talk. And so this is going to be thinking about very simple models of social network evolution. And one of the reasons that I think thinking about the evolution or evolutionary change in social networks is quite difficult is because we know in many animal populations that the emergent outcome of an individual's social interactions or associations, which we can capture with its social network position, has important fitness implications. This has been demonstrated empirically in a wide number of studies, and also we can explain it intuitively in many others. So for example, in a population suffering from an infectious disease that carries mortality costs, if you have a higher degree and you're more likely to become infected, it's going to reduce your chances of survival. But the relationship between individuals' social behavioral phenotypes and their social network position is a lot less clear. It might vary with context, it might be nonlinear, and it will certainly vary between different species. And so the fact that we don't know very much about this relationship and it might change could be very important in making evolutionary predictions about this system. Another important aspect of this is that indirect effects play a massive role in understanding an individual's social network position. So an individual's social network position isn't just an outcome of its own social phenotype, it's the outcome of all of its neighbors' social phenotypes as well. No matter how sociable you are, you're not going to have a high degree if you're surrounded by loners. And so these two factors combining can make it quite hard to predict how social networks might evolve over time. And I'm going to try and demonstrate this to you now by using a very simple model of social network evolutionary demography and demonstrating how it can at times produce very counterintuitive outcomes. And so in our first of our two example models, we're going to take a set of individuals that vary in a trait that I'm going to call sociability. And this trait sociability is just their tendency to interact with each other, so their tendency to form connections to other individuals in the network. What we're then going to do is set a rule that says that individuals that have higher degree centrality, so this is just their number of connections in the network, are more likely to survive to the next time step, and individuals that survive are able to reproduce, and offspring tend to have similar social phenotypes, so measures of sociability to their parents. We're then going to look at how in the population levels of sociability and levels of degree centrality change over time. And this example is nice and easy. It's going to play out exactly how you thought it was going to. So our population is going to get more sociable over time. Individuals are going to prefer to form more social interactions. And what happens to our social network is that it changes to become more and more highly connected until eventually it can't really become any more connected. So this is a nice example of a social network evolving in a way that's straightforward to predict. What we're going to do now, though, is take our very simple model and change it very slightly. So instead of degree centrality affecting the survival of individuals, we're going to now say that individuals with higher clustering coefficients are able to survive better. And so clustering coefficient is a measure of the proportion of an individual's connections that are interconnected themselves. So the number of your friends that are friends with each other, which is a good measure of social integration, or whether you're found in a clique, for example. And we're now going to look at the same pattern over time. How does clustering coefficient change over time when higher clustering coefficients help you to survive better? We're going to start with a population that has a relatively high clustering coefficient, and we're going to look at how this changes over time as a result of these evolutionary mechanisms. Bearing in mind that individuals with higher clustering coefficient are more likely to survive. But what we see isn't really what you would expect at all. over time, the average clustering coefficient of our population, initially at least, decreases very fast, even though individuals with the highest clustering coefficient are surviving better. What we then see if we let this play out is eventually we end up in a situation where this approximately stabilizes. So even though we've got this positive selection based on clustering coefficient, the average clustering coefficient of our population is not changing at all. So this isn't something that I have time to talk about now, but I can also feature in the discussion if people are interested. I think this is a really fascinating example of how thinking about the evolution of social networks themselves can potentially be really important in thinking about these longer term patterns and dynamics and potentially play out in ways that we wouldn't expect. And so I really just wanted to sum up very quickly, and hopefully I've demonstrated today the importance of infectious disease dynamics and demography in interacting with social structure through how they affect the social dynamics of animal populations, in particular through their effects on behavioral plasticity, but also in placing constraints on individuals in how they can interact. And then I've touched a little bit on the role of evolutionary change that's associated with each of these factors, and how without really focusing on these eco-evolutionary dynamics and thinking more about the theory that underlines this, we're going to really struggle, I think, to explain some of the patterns that we're most interested in, especially in thinking about interspecific variation in animal social network structure and dynamics. And so with that, there's a huge list of people I'd like to thank for various different aspects of this research, and I'm happy to take any questions that people have.
Well, Matt, thank you very much for such a great talk. Incredible. We open now for questions. So please remember to type in a question mark. If you're a student, type an S next to the question mark, and I will call your name. And if you're on YouTube, we will make sure to relay the question to the speaker. So our first question comes from Filippo. Oh, and before, please remember to say your name and your affiliation so we create a sense of community. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana, for the reminder, because I'm one of those, I always forget that, so good. And thank you, Matthew. This is Filippo Aureli from Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico, and I really love the talk. And you made it, I think, affordable to anybody to follow, because your technical terms, you give a very good explanation in real what actually it means. You emphasized the fact that sometimes you talk about actual social interaction, sometimes you talk only about association between individuals, other times about movement, and that was again very clear. Often we talk about all different things and we talk about social relationships. That clearly is not the case with movement, for instance, or sometimes even with association. So I think it was very good what you did, and I appreciate. My other comment, and then I'm going to ask a question, is that I think, and maybe this is again for the people that are not very familiar with the social network, or they are fascinated about social network. A lot of the things that have been done, and you have been talking as well, are with the measure of at the individual level, like related to the measure of centrality, like degree or strength, that actually have been used for ages before social network analysis came about, because there's no need at all to count. Degree is the number of connection, so you don't need a social network to count the number of connection. And strength is the kind of the weight of this connection. Again, you don't need a social network. But you did a very nice step, and that's where my questions are, when you get from the individual level, which of course is the selection works, where you have these elements on impact on the infectious diseases and so on. But you got at the population level, and I really think that in the second part, especially, and I think maybe I go for a follow-up question later on, for knowing what you were suggesting, then maybe there's some development. But even on the first part of your talk, when you went to talk about the popularity score at the level of the population level and group level, I think it was fascinating. So I didn't catch how you calculate this popularity score in the first part, and now I understand, but I don't think it's the same. When you mention popularity now in the very end, there was I think it was maybe something about the number of connections, but I think in the first part, I think it was something at the group level. So that would be nice if you can tell me, and because I think that result was really, really interesting, showing how things the individual do, yet at the level of the group or population, and they have implication also again back to the individuals.
Yeah, sorry, that was something that I realized just after I'd finished saying it, I'd forgotten to say, and I really should have done. So I'm going to keep the explanation relatively light in terms of exactly what it means, but the popularity score is effectively a measure of the centralization of the network. So it's a difference in the degree score of our, like, the most popular individuals versus the normal individuals. And so we know in that network that the final endpoint, because it's got those very artificial rules, is to have our 3 incredibly popular individuals right in the middle. And so that measure, if it's 1, is saying we've ended up in that exact situation. And if it's, as it decreases, it's saying we're getting slightly further and further from that situation. So the simple version is it's just a measure of the network centralization. And we've tested out various additional scenarios. And so Nina's lab, when they originally developed that model, they have the popularity version. They also have a betweenness and a closeness version. And so we've got similar scores and similar ways of looking at organization for those different versions. But the popularity one is the simplest. But you're right that I completely forgot. And I didn't forget when I was practicing the talk. It's just one of those things that slips your mind in when it's actually happening. But it's that success of social organization is basically what it's capturing.
No, I thought so. Thank you. You did a fantastic job about defining everything. So if you missed one, I thought I was the one missing. But I mean, there was a different measure of popularity that you use at the end. That's why I called me that. That cannot be. But that's a great thing because it is at the group level. And thank you for the explanation.
Yeah. So I think how I see those simulations a little bit right now is that example is a little bit extreme. It's probably unlikely that that's exactly how any animal groups that will work, unless you could think of a particular situation where, like, social information is really driving everything, or, like, I don't know, maybe you could create artificial scenarios in humans. But it's just a really nice, simple toy example of showing that in a situation where a group, the emergent outcome of these interactions is a really strong social structure, that demography places constraints that potentially stops groups from reaching that. We're testing out versions that look more at social assortment according to a different phenotype at the moment, and they're a little bit more fiddly, but hopefully they'll be ready soon. We're just trying to get the paper ready to write up over the next few months.
Then I'll follow up because I had a question on this particular point, but I thought I'd do it later, and then I stop. So yeah, you mentioned there's a bit probably kind of too fast or too quick this social updating in that particular model, because you didn't tell the time frame, but because that doesn't matter. But the fact that every individual will change the partners, they drop 2 and they get 2 new acts so often. I think all in a kind of simultaneous way, I understand, or very quick, clearly is not realistic, but still create a situation that is realistic. You can stretch on time. That probably happens. It just I don't know if it happens much less often. They will have a very different results in a short term for sure, but then maybe in the long term will be exactly the same results of the simulation that you got, right?
Yeah, so I think what you tend to see is a situation where you start from a fairly random set of connections and then you work towards the optimum situation. And so all of the results that I presented today were once everything had stabilized, like how close to the optimum can it get once it's stabilized. But you definitely have that period during the updating where it's moving towards that. And to some extent, the demographic constraints are there just stopping it being able to get to that final point.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Filippo. Okay, Emil, I'm going to give the chance to Will and then Ecology, okay? So Will, could you ask your question, please?
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. My name is Will. I'm a 4th year PhD student at Yale as an I thought this was a great talk, and I think it connects a lot of the things that I'm really excited about right now in terms of connecting social centralities and immunity. And I guess that's kind of the place that I want to start, Matthew, is asking you, when you think about these models of SI dynamics on networks and the clear role of like centrality within those networks in terms of driving the costs of parasite exposure, essentially. What do you think about, and you've mentioned this a lot throughout the talk, like the idea that because information is exchanged in potentially very similar ways that you're measuring on these networks, how does the covariance of those two things determine costs and benefits for who's there? And then when you're thinking about things like the aging patterns, right? Those are potentially individuals who have already gained what they're going to gain from social information or something, right? There's maybe like, different ways of thinking about like the susceptibility within these networks and the exposure patch processes happening on them. And I imagine too, as soon as you get to like different types of information or different types of parasite, like history traits, right? There's all different ways to like decompose these patterns that maybe helps understand them. Is that something you're interested in, or how do you think that factors into the kind of like simplistic models that you're building that I think build great intuition, but maybe differ from like what we see in biological reality or empirical examples?
Yes, absolutely. These models are far too oversimplistic to understand the full biological reality, but we do have to start somewhere. The discussion of that macaque paper is full of many of the things you've just said. I've not really, so I've come at this from someone who's worked a lot with social networks and a lot in kind of network epidemiology and not really thought about aging very much, but I've now talked to Erin too much. And I've also moved to a department in Edinburgh that has some fantastic aging people. And so learning about how selection acts at different stages of adult lifespan is really fascinating. We're busy trying to think about ways in which you can make evolutionary arguments about social aging and infectious disease that don't rely on making arguments entirely related to the later part of life, where you have the selection shadow that means that evolutionary pressures would have to be really strong. And I think there are probably various things that you could do. So for example, if you tend to reduce your social network centrality when you feel a bit shit, and it's more of a plastic behavior and the selection on that plasticity, then that might explain some of these social aging effects if we assume that older individuals just feel a bit ropey more often. We could also think about particular other situations where it's the inverse of, if it's the inverse of selection that's happening earlier in life, you can also, but it might also be that this isn't a process of selection at all. It's just a happy coincidence that you get less central for other reasons, and then there are benefits from an infectious disease perspective. I think the question about immunity relates in a lot of way to the example that I gave about strength at the end of that example as well, in terms of individuals aren't reducing their strength, even though, and it's not just in that macaque system, we know that from, like, meta-analyses on animal populations show the biggest thing you can do to reduce your infectious disease risk is reducing your weighted degree. And it seems likely that in that situation, the benefits they gain from being strongly connected are so high, both from other reasons, but also potentially in terms of being healthier and happier, that if you ignore them from the model as we have, then it kind of underestimates that. And there's some really cool work on social buffering and showing that in some species, in particular types of interaction, being central in terms of thinking about your social integration and your high strength actually protects you from certainly the costs of disease, even if it makes you more likely to be infected from directly transmissible pathogens. So that side of things, I think there's some really cool work beginning to appear in behavioral ecology and ecology, and there's also some really interesting theoretical models in network science. I've seen multi-layer network papers that model the transmission of disease in one layer and the transmission of like social support in a second layer, and looking at how the correlation between those two layers affects the dynamics that you see. And so I think there's a lot of cool work to be done at that kind of interface. And then information and behavioral change is another key part of it. And it is something that I'm super interested in. It's something that I published on a little bit. And I think some of the key to that is the fact that not for all information and not for all behaviors, but in behavior and infectious disease often spread in different ways. And it's by thinking about the fact that they spread in different ways from each other that can potentially explain how animals might mitigate those trade-offs. Again, hopefully I showed that in the very last part of my talk. There's a difference in explaining the network structures and the network positions that best mitigate those trade-offs, which is something that we've begun to do, and actually explaining how those structures arise. Because we need to be able to explain how an animal can follow quite simple rules to end up in these positions. And so thinking about actually selection on the social phenotypes that result in these very complicated network positions and is a really important part of it. There's no way an animal is sat there calculating its closeness centrality and which social community it's in and the entire modularity of its social group. There's got to be something simpler going on that then explains these mechanisms. So yes, I think the information disease thing is fascinating as well, and I'm really hoping that I can do more work to kind of explore that interface from a more evolutionary angle, but I'm also kind of scared of tackling some of those evolutionary questions in networks because it's really difficult.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really good.
Cool, thank you, Will. Now I can call Amiel.
Hi, thank you, Matthew. That was a really amazing talk and surely a lot to think about. I think I would like to ask, you surely showed a lot of models and different, network measures. And to me, it seems like an individual that is trying to achieve some social position that will, balance costs and benefits and so on. It is almost like an unachievable target. First, the target moves with time and with seasons and so on. And then it's not only about myself, like, I don't know, but the temperature in my room now is comfortable. And if not, I can change some things. But then the social environment is so complex. So even if I don't change anything, my environment might change because actions of other individuals, and that will affect me, surely, in terms of susceptibility and so on. And so I guess my question is, and maybe it relates to some results you showed on the geese, if I'm not mistaken. What kind of mechanism do you think animals use to sort of keep themselves not far from the optimal target? And given that you worked on so many different systems and species, do you think it requires, strong cognitive abilities, or and can we actually find some simple rules that animals follow to maintain these things?
So I think maybe if I'm interpreting the question correctly, it kind of comes down to the bit towards the end of my talk in the final model where I was talking about us not necessarily having a good idea of how the social phenotype that individuals have, or their phenotype just in general, because it could be non-social phenotype too, links to their network position. Because I think we can, once you have the position of an individual in a network, that can actually affect their demographic rates, for example, just independently of how they ended up there. But I do think it's a real challenge in estimating that relationship. I think your point about not being able to control your network position is really interesting. I think that ties quite nicely to my clustering coefficient example, where we get the opposite response to selection. And the reason that happens is because when you have a really densely connected network, individuals that have the fewest connections have the highest clustering coefficient. And when you have a really sparse network, so one without many connections, what happens is that individuals with the most connections have the highest clustering coefficient. And so there's an example where if you take my word for the fact that in this imaginary population of animals, the only social phenotype is this, like, I tend to interact with each other, then that relationship between my phenotype and my network position completely changes depending on what the other individuals in the population are doing. And so it's not a real example, but I think that really nicely supports the point you made. I always try and stop myself when I start coming up with mechanisms that are too cognitive, because I think my interest is, can we explain things without invoking like complicated cognitive rules? That, and I guess I've worked a lot on species that aren't immediately associated with high levels of cognition as well. Like I think geese, and beginning to work a little bit on sheep now and stuff like that. I don't think you can justifiably use those mechanisms. I think for geese, a lot of it is based around anger. which may not surprise anyone. I think that's a really difficult question. I'm really hopeful that now we have a lot more social network data from a lot more species, we can try and come up with some general mechanisms that might be important for explaining things in a lot of cases. But I think it's probably not going to be possible to explain. There are always going to be species that do stuff differently to each other, and there's always going to be ecological contexts that have a stronger effect than any like species level differences and stuff. So I'm not kidding myself that it's an easy challenge or that we're particularly close to fully understanding it. But I'd like to think that as we build data sets across more and more species and people begin to collate them, it's possible to begin to start to try and understand some of these patterns. I got a bit sidetracked there. Sorry, it's a complicated question.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Okay, so there's a question from Maren.
Hello, my name is Maren Hook. I'm at the University of Derby. And as a little bit of background for those of you who are not from the UK and therefore probably don't know too much about the badger problem in the UK. So badgers have been very much prosecuted in former times. And when they were very low in their population levels, there came a Badger Act. So they are very highly protected species. It isn't allowed to kill badgers, to handle them, to disturb them in any way. However, as Matthew said, they are transmitting bovine tuberculosis. Therefore, they are hated by cattle farmers, because if a cattle herd has bovine tuberculosis, essentially the farmer has to kill the entire herd of cattle. So a farmer definitely doesn't want to have bovine tuberculosis in their herd. And badgers, like many other animals, are a natural reservoir of bovine tuberculosis, and they go to farms, eat the food, and then they can, through their spittle and saliva, they can transmit bovine tuberculosis to the cattle. So for that reason, badgers don't like, farmers don't like badgers on their farm. The general public in Britain loves and adores badgers. So one of the actions that the British government is doing is they kill, or they have in certain areas, badger culls. So they have an exception to the Badger Act that normally says you aren't allowed to kill badgers. And then entire populations of badgers are essentially wiped out, or they try to wipe out the entire population, which obviously is not very much liked by the general public. And therefore, and this relates obviously very much to disease dynamics, and the social network thing is very highly relevant to the whole understanding of this. And now I'm coming to my question. I was very surprised by your finding that essentially when there are less individuals, there's less movement between groups, and therefore that would mean that there's less likelihood of disease transmission, which would be in favor of killing or culling badgers. But if I remember correctly, there's another study by, I think, Rosie Woodruff, who found that if you are culling badgers, there's actually more movement, because badgers from outside the culling area are moving into the area, and therefore you have actually a higher turnover, and therefore a higher transmission rate, and therefore that paper argued that culling is actually not good and is not going to prevent the spread of bovine tuberculosis. So where do you think are the differences between your findings and that other study come from?
So I think this is probably my fault for stopping a little bit short of where I could have done from the epidemiological perspective, but I think you've slightly misinterpreted exactly what the results show. So the key thing that's driving badger movements for female badgers in particular is the availability of set locations or breeding opportunities, and the key thing that's driving the movement of male badgers is the presence of more female badgers in a set than there are male badgers. And so I think what's happening in the Woodchester Park system, and this was a study across the period of time where that population was stable and unaffected by culling, is that simply what's happening is when the population is declining, then there are more dispersal opportunities close by. So the badgers don't have to go very far. The culling situation is quite different to that, because what's happening then is that free locations to disperse to are being opened up all over the landscape. And so in that situation, the actual dynamics are a little bit different. So I think the difference there is between a stable population and a kind of transient situation. And what will happen in the situation with culling is what you tend to find is that in the center of the cull zone, not much is really happening. So assuming that the cull is effective and that they're able to remove all of the individuals, culling is effective in the very center of the zone where they do it, because you've now got no badgers at all. And the problem comes around the edges, and it tends to be individuals moving from outside the edges into the edges, and that makes things really bad because you're getting movement where there was previously not movement. And that's a little bit of a different situation to the one where we're studying movement within a stable population. And so I think actually exactly the same mechanism is driving both patterns. It's the distribution of available territories or opportunities to disperse to, but it's the same mechanism actually ends up resulting in very different patterns of behavior. So exactly what you said is happening during the cull, where around the edges of cull zones, you tend to get increased dispersal, you tend to break down territory boundaries, and you increase opportunities for disease to spread between groups. But I think it's a very similar mechanism, but it just plays out in a different way between the stable and the transient populations.
Thank you. I had been wondering whether there was culling or whether that was just a normal small or bigger population size.
Yeah, they managed to keep the culling away from that study site for quite a prolonged period of time. It did start happening in the end fairly recently, but it was protected from a lot of those dynamics for a very protracted period of time.
Thank you, Maren. Let's see. Oh, there's no other questions, so I'm going to go with mine, and then I call Filippo. I have a couple of questions, but I'm going to just stay two, and then I'll do the other one. These are related to the very first models, and so in one part you mentioned that you get this demographic structure where you have more reproductive success, and then I'm assuming because you have more reproductive success, your demography shifts towards more younger individuals, and then you get more degree. So I'm not sure if you have included in the model any type of phenotype where individuals that are young tend to be more sociable, or this is only the effect of degree on its own. And if so, I mean, even if you have or not this phenotype, do you think that shifting the demography towards younger individuals would actually drive the effect of having a higher degree?
I think that's a really interesting question. It's not something that I addressed explicitly in any of those models, I think. Maybe if you're asking about the last model, where I was looking explicitly at the evolution, then that model was very simple. Just individuals had a phenotype that was set for the duration of their lifetime. That then affected their behavior. I can answer not from my work, but from the work in the Kaio macaques, where they tried to do some simulations of groups with different age structures. And I'm maybe not entirely getting it right, so you might want to check the paper that they wrote. But I'm pretty sure they found it actually quite difficult to find differences between groups in network structure when they changed the age distributions, even though the macaques of different ages have different social positions. I don't entirely know why that was. It's too long since I've read that paper or talked to Erin or Josephine about it. But I think it's one of those interesting things where it should happen, and I think for simple rules and simple measures, you could probably make it happen. So I think if you had younger individuals who are much more sociable, and sociability is tied directly to degree, it should probably be fairly straightforward to predict that that would be happening. But I don't know. I don't know where that might break. There might be situations where it might break down, and there might be really more interesting dynamics when you look at more involved network measures that take into account the fuller structure. I think it would be really cool to look at. It kind of gets at the idea of, like from population ecology, of like stability and transience again, and the idea that you might there might be stable social networks alongside kind of stable age structures of populations. I think it's really interesting. I have no idea. It'd be really cool.
Yeah, and well, maybe I mix up the models, but there were so many. But then I think this one is the first one you presented. My second question relates to the effect of distance in your network. And I'm assuming distance is between social groups, right? So it's the fact that you can actually interact with the other group. Did I get it right?
So this was talking about the badger movement networks?
No, the previous one.
Oh, the Canada geese?
Yeah.
So the Canada goose analysis we did, there were two variables that we focused on in that model that I presented there. The one was whether you molted at the same location as individuals that were removed from the population or not. Okay. So it's kind of a binary measure. So Canada geese are very mobile for almost all of the year, but there's a month in the middle of the summer where they're molting their wing feathers, and so they can't fly. And so they basically pick one lake and stay on that lake to stay as safe from predators as they could be. The culls tend to take place during that period because it's much easier to catch birds that can't fly. And so the geese are rounded up and killed during that period. And so what happened was that half of the birds at those locations were killed and the other half were left alive. And so the variable we were looking at in terms of space was just whether they molted at the same location as the ones that were removed. And then the other variable that I probably explained too briefly on the x-axis of the bottom plots was the idea. So that was then looking at a dyadic regression, so explaining the presence or absence or strength of a dyad. And that was looking at the aggregate strength of connections of both individuals in that dyad to individuals that were removed. So that was more of a like social distance measure, I guess, albeit it's only considering one step away. We did also look at various points at like other measures of space, and we tried to look a little bit about how the culling had affected their spatial behavior, but we were a little bit limited by sample size in terms of number of relocations, and also there wasn't really much strong evidence that they really changed their spatial behavior very much. But I think part of that is, so contrasting it to the badgers, which Maren explained really well, the badgers are very territorial and a lot of their opportunities are driven by like territory availability and reproductive opportunities, whilst the geese are a much more, I guess they're more like flying ungulates, right? They're forming these feeding flocks and moving over, like feeding on grass or feeding on aquatic vegetation. And so their social system is quite different. And so I think what's happening there is that when individuals are removed, you're not seeing the same like breakdown of territories and changes in demographic opportunities. It ties quite nicely those findings to the experiment they did in the White & Woods great tit system, where they experimentally took great tits away for a little bit. And almost the same thing happened, where they've tended to strengthen their social relationships with individuals they were already connected to. And it's a little bit similar to the work in Zurich in Barbara Koenig's lab, where they looked at the consequences for the mouse social network when the cat got into their barn. Where once again, I think the difference probably is the territoriality and the strength of the territoriality. I think species without those strong territory things, you might get quite different patterns to species with strong territoriality. That's my explanation for the goose finding. I think we were just a bit limited in terms of the data structure, in terms of being able to explore the spatial stuff more in a nicer way than just present at a cull site or not present at a cull site. I would have loved to have done that, but that analysis was quite tricky as it was. So,
but super cool that, I mean, we have an effect also from spatial location of the individuals, and that also changes a little bit. Still, the overall result is consistent, which is pretty cool. Okay, I'll keep my question after Filippo's question.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you. This is Filippo Aureli from Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico. Again, first I want to do a comment on the mechanism part. The Amiel mentioned and Matthew answering in a way that could, with the example, it could be anger for the geese. I believe, and others like me have been maybe, that a lot of this potentially cognitively complicated bookkeeping of who is whom and who is interacting with whom at the individual level with their own. I'm not talking about the relationship or the relation or the other relationship. That probably needs cognition involved. But at the kind of central, the individual with their own connection is probably done and mediated from an emotional point of view. And so, as we do most of the time, we don't think about, okay, I do this with a particular individual because I've done this yesterday and they did that, but I just have gut feeling about behaving in that particular way with an individual and not with another. So the differentiation of social relationship, I believe, is mediated from an emotional point of view. And anybody want to know more about it, I'm happy to talk about it. So that's basically, I don't know if I answer completely the entire complicated and complex picture that Matthew present in all these networks, but at least if we ask the question how individuals keep track of things that leads to aspects at the social network level, I think the individual doesn't need to have highly cognitively developed capacity. But my question is for Matt, again, great job and great answering, is I think it was very, very nice how you, the result you presented on the aging with the Caio Macaque group, showing how two measures of centrality, degree and strength, they are really different in the result. You find that degree is not a good way to do it, but it's better to focus on strength. But the best part of all, to me, there, and that's, I think you hint that maybe there's going to be further work on that direction, and to ask you during the discussion, so that's my point, is when you kind of talked about social integration, looking at the clustering coefficient. And so I don't know if you can expand some more about how that could lead to further advances in this area that you were hinting in your talk.
Oh, so specifically regard to the social aging work?
No, not necessarily. I'm talking about in that moment you were talking about, with the cluster coefficient and so on, that there will be more to do, and I can talk later in the discussion. So I'm happy to hear anything on further things on this evolutionary point of view, because I really think it's a very challenging. I agree with you. I think it's you, I, and everybody else. We are on much safer ground when we work on ecological things and some now what happened yesterday, tomorrow, not at the revolutionary level. But that's just fascinating. So, and I think you have tools to move in that direction. So I kind of want to hear from you about that.
Yeah. So I think we've got, there's various different levels of these things. We've got more data from the models that we've run already, where we looked at different functional forms for that relationship between age and some of the immunosenescence that we looked at. So we looked at exponential as well as linear things, and then we decided that that was going to be an absolutely horrific paper to read if we tried to fit everything into the same paper. And the other thing that I've got, which speaks to Will's question a little bit, which I'm really excited to try out, but it's quite hard. I find it quite hard with these little things that I want to test out when they're quite involved simulation modeling, is finding the right person to help test these things, because they're the sort of things where if I task a ecology evolution master's student with it, it's a little bit unfair almost. But we've got a model that I adapted. Again, this is stealing from Nina's work, who's an incredible mathematical biologist who I've been lucky enough to work with, where she had a really cool model looking at thinking about ectoparasites and grooming networks. And the fact that in a grooming network, you're both putting yourself at risk of being infected with ectoparasites, but also you're going to be pulling literally ectoparasites off each other. And so I adapted a model that she wrote that looked at that in binary networks for weighted networks, where again, you can look at variation in disease cost with age, and then have this model where you've got, when you interact with others, you're putting yourself at risk, but it's also helping to cure you, basically. And that's a model that I'm really interested to test in that perspective, because I think actually, to some extent, thinking about ectoparasites could be more impactful, more interesting from that point of view. The infectious disease stuff is kind of tricky, right? Because we know that there are illnesses from which we suffer regularly and we don't maintain long immune memories from. But there's still a bit of an immune memory, and it's not entirely clear what happens when you're infected the second time and the third time and so on. And it's all a bit of a pain. Whilst I think the ecology for ectoparasites is a lot bit simpler. You're fine until you've got loads of them, and then you're in trouble. And so I'd love to play with that little model a little bit more, and I'd love to move in the direction of actually beginning to think about the evolutionary side of things. But I think for me, that's actually quite a medium to long-term goal. It relies on talking with Erin about it a little bit more, and then talking with some of the people in Edinburgh. He's up here, has done a lot of evolutionary ecology events. Colleague as well is a really great theorist for aging evolution stuff. So I talked to Jacob about some of the social stuff, and he got really excited about thinking about some of the ways that in which you could explain social aging. But we were really just at the start of thinking about that. So it's tricky because I try and do too many things, and then can do none of those things as well as I want to do them.
Okay, thank you. Well, there is a question from Will.
Sorry, if you wanted to go, Adrian, you definitely can.
Oh, no. My pleasure, please do.
Great. I work in the buffalo system in South Africa with Vanessa, and so there's a lot of things that we're doing trying to leverage this kind of piecemeal social network to look at patterns of immunity and its relationship with both parasitism, resources, and how those things are interrelated. And we're finding some really cool stuff, I think at least, where like different social centralities are telling you different things about the risk of acquiring parasites. So like PageRank, because our network is kind of broken apart in different pieces, right, is really strongly related to like the risk of acquiring parasites, where other things like stability and that kind of stuff aren't. But then they're also differently related to the immune responses that individuals are actually manifesting through time. And those seem to be like somewhat independent based on what you're looking at from the actual parasites themselves, and some of it might be explained by resources. But it seems like, at least in some of the later work, one of the things you're focusing in on is this idea that like different types of centrality at the node can maybe tell you different things about what that node is experiencing. And I think the thing that's really cool in like the very, very last chapter you showed is this idea that obviously an individual cannot manifest its own closeness centrality or its own, strength even to some degree. And those things must be like inherent personality traits if they're going to be acted on by evolutionary forces. So when we go out into like empirical networks like Prahat did, to talk about these kinds of like dynamics of epidemics and centralities and modularity networks, do you feel like there's ways to decompose the topology of those networks that gets closer to what an individual actually had the capacity to enforce? In this idea of like my personality is generating something in the network, even though it's also a collective phenotype? Or do you feel like there needs to be something even sub, centrality or topology to actually get to those factors? Like, do we need to go out and actually do personality experiments at every single node in the network to understand something about what the individual is manifesting versus like what is the collective phenotype as a result?
I mean, I think, this answer's going to be complicated and probably in some ways. I do think it's really valuable when we can to think about how an individual's phenotype is contributing to its position in the network that we observe. I'm going to lean on two papers that I've been a co-author on recently when I'm describing the way that I like to try and think about these things now, or the way that I think we can move towards testing some of these things. And the first of those is a paper that Delphine de Moor led, who's another postdoc in Lauren Brent's lab in Exeter, where we tried to think, this was more from a comparative point of view, but tried to think about the way we think about networks at different levels. And so often when we go out into the wild and we measure or observe a network, what we then try and do depends on the research questions we have, and actually I think leads to more fights than we need to have when we're doing social network things on wild animals. Because when I'm a disease ecologist, and I guess I cross over both fields a little bit here, all I really care about at the end of the day is the actual network of interactions or associations that happen and the implications of that for transmission. I get my network of actual interactions, I try and sample that as best as I can, and if I need to, try and fill in the blanks. And then that's my substrate over which disease spreads. As a behavioral ecologist or a behavioral disease ecologist, maybe I want to go a step further than that. We have our network that we've sampled, and we're trying to get from that network that we've sampled to a real network of interactions or associations that have happened in reality. And behavioral ecologists are often interested in going one step further from that, to move from that network of associations that have happened to a network of like social preferences that underlie that. So this is a bit like me following you around pubs and restaurants, recording everyone who you're in pubs and restaurants with, and hoping to use that to work out your friends, right? That's basically what we're doing to a lot of animals all the time, especially with association networks. And so I think trying to think about networks across that, across those kind of layers, and thinking about the processes that are going between each of those layers can be really valuable. I think the second part of that is to understand the non-sampling bits of that process. Really requires, if we can, generative models for why those networks are the way they are. So we can describe the structure of these networks and we can fit regressions. And to some extent, a regression can be somewhat of a generative model, but the more we can build into that generative model, the more power we have to try and understand why the system is the way it is. And so I guess that's not necessarily me advocating for going out and trying to measure the personality of every buffalo, which sounds like it would be phenomenally difficult. But it's about trying to take the information that we have and that what we understand might be important for social networks or social network structure in different systems, whether that be size or color or the constraints imposed by the landscape, and trying to use that when we can to build a model to see if we can explain the social network structure we have. And so there's a really great paper that Josephine Bohr-Brask, who's a colleague in Denmark, has led, and we have a preprint of out right now that looks a bit at generative models and thinking about generative models of animal social networks. And I think that's a really cool way of trying to think about more the processes that cause networks to be the way they are. I mean, it's much like fitting a statistical model, right? We're never going to be able to get everything. And what we'll be able to measure and study is different between different systems. So I get around these problems largely by, when I get really stuck on that sort of thing, just resorting to playing with models and simulations, because then things do what I want them to.
Thank you, Will. Okay, now I have a question from Lauren.
Hey, Matt. Thank you. That was really fascinating. I've been really enjoying the discussion too. I'm not even sure I have a good question, but I wanted to just get the opportunity to talk to you about it. I like to think a lot in terms of Kapler's model for social systems with the 4 interrelated components. And I think you were touching on this a little bit. I was wondering, could you speak to like modeling, sort of thinking about how there are direct and indirect impacts of the different components? So I would think network structure is under social structure. You got, care system, social organization, group size, composition, and then mating system, which I tend to ignore. It's more of an outcome, I think. But then thinking about how those could directly or indirectly impact each other, and then fitness. Is that an attainable goal, or is that so complex that you can't even get there?
So remind me of the four parts.
So the 4 components are social organizations. So that's who you're living with. Group size, group composition. So we think in terms with the Degus, we think a lot about the number of individuals, the sex composition, and also homophilia and masculinization among the females, because there's benefits to hanging out with similar females. And then we think about how that affects the care system, communal care versus male, female care, just biparental care, etc. And then social structure, again, is, I think networks fall under that. There's so much, think about how individuals could potentially interact. And then when you think about fitness consequences being a social system, it can be impacted either directly by one of those 3 things or interactively. So if there's a change in the social organization due to a death, which gets at your culling idea, the ideas of culling, that could potentially, I think what you're trying to get at is how that affects who you interact with, right? And how you interact with them. So how does that then affect fitness? And are there direct and multi-step pathways to that fitness outcome? I apologize, it's not clear. I haven't fully thought through the ideas, but
No,
I've been thinking about this for years now, and I just can't get there.
It's really fascinating. I wonder to what extent of the categories you suggested, you can use networks probably to get at the social organization and the social structure if you think about them at different scales, maybe, and maybe it helps from that perspective. I mean, one thing, so this should really be Ross talking about this, who was lurking on the Zoom call for a while, with the model that I talked about social organization and just looking at demographic constraints. One way we've talked about extending that model was to add in relationships between where an individual was in a network and its fitness, but also the organization of the entire social group and its fitness. And so I think that kind of gets partly at your question, because it's looking at that potential trade-offs between like group success and individual success in explaining different components of an individual's fitness. I can do that in a model. I think this is the thing that I struggle with sometimes as someone who like inadequately mathematically models and is increasingly far away from working in the field. There are lots of things I can do with a model, especially when it's a simulation model, but whether it's sensible to do or whether it's at all easy to attach to reality is a challenge. So I think from a modeling perspective, I could see the way you could set up a model to address the questions that you have. Mm-hmm. I think the challenge then is to find a system that has detailed enough data that allows you to test quite a complicated model like that over a long enough time frame and being able to tailor the model to that system. And so I guess my answer is that I don't see a reason why what you've described isn't feasible in some ways, but it would be very challenging. I think it would only be possible in very few study systems, and it would take a fairly unique combination of people's skills, and it would involve a lot of time and energy, I think. I think even just thinking about these things ecologically can be really difficult. You touched on me talking about like the loss of associates and what it means for network structure, and it's something that we're hoping to try and do with the Soe sheep that I managed to sneak into the start of the talk at least, where we're trying to think about the links between population resilience and social network resilience. But even then, those concepts are quite hard to define and can be thought about in so many different ways that it's just really challenging to think about. You would have to build a model so complex that it's quite hard to fit to data. And even if it explained the data that you have, there are probably many other models of similar complexity that could also explain the data you have. And I think that's probably the challenge. And so I think it takes a lot of effort and isn't possible in very many study systems. But I don't see any reason conceptually that it couldn't be possible.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'd love to talk to you more about it some other time, maybe.
Yeah, that would be great.
Because we see a lot of cool stuff in the Daegu system where stability of group size matters, and yet there are sexual conflict in how stability affects fitness, and it's a complete mess. And so I've always wondered, is there some way we could actually dig into this and look at how the different components connect and affect fitness, and maybe network analysis is the better way to get at it then.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to talk more at some point if you want.
Yeah, thank you. And great talk. Again, by the way, I'm Lauren. I'm Taze. I'm at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, co-host Fine. And again, I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Lauren. Do we have any question from the YouTube?
I didn't see any.
Yeah. Okay.
Of course, it just broke. My screen just went asleep.
So maybe I'll just ask a last question in the last 5 minutes. But this is not quite a question. It's just kind of getting your thoughts on this, Matt. And then we can close the YouTube, I think. Or maybe we can close it now and then we can just keep chatting. Yeah, okay. So thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Matt, for accepting our invitation. Just a correction, next week we don't have a Fine seminar. It's kind of like a fall break for everyone. And so we'll meet again the week after that. Just keep an eye on the email. And then it will be Silvia Kaiser talking about social